Hello, welcome back to Frequencies, tuning in to frequencies of human behavior, perspective, and empathy. I'm Matt, and this is part 2 of the generational mini-series, where we're going to cover all the generations going back to the silent generation. On the last episode, that's where we started, was the silent generation, the people shaped by scarcity, war, and survival, and the ones who would go on to raise the next wave. Today, we're going to talk about that next wave, in particular, the baby boomers. That's right. Born between 1946 and 1964, the boomers were quite literally a population explosion. The result of a country coming home from World War II, stepping out of survival mode and into something that looked more like optimism, stability, and a whole lot of new life, literally. The war ended and families began. And the last episode, I mentioned a personal story about someone in my own circle who came back from war and left a trail of children across America. It's a messy human example, but it reflects something bigger. This wasn't just one story. This was happening everywhere. I've talked to many people about my story, and when I do, people often share their stories, and oftentimes they say, oh yeah, well, my uncle, my grandpa. It's everywhere. The population surged, and with it came an entirely new generation that would grow up in a world very different from the one their parents knew. And that upbringing matters tremendously, because while today is about the boomers, you can't separate them from the silent generation. They were raised by people who valued discipline, resilience, and conformity. People who had learned to keep their heads down and just push through. And those values, they stuck. And now, I'll be honest, throughout this episode, I might sound a little critical, maybe even a little frustrated at times, but it's not coming from a place of blame. It's coming from a place of observation, because it's not really about individuals. It's about patterns. It's about what happens when a generation raised in one kind of world is suddenly faced with a completely different one. And that's where things start to get complicated, because today the boomers hold a significant portion of the wealth and influence in society. At the same time, they're navigating a world that doesn't operate the way it used to. A world that's moving faster, changing faster, and demanding different ways of thinking. And sometimes that friction shows. Things change, right? Sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes it's a little ironic. Sometimes it's even a little bit funny. But underneath all of that, there's something deeper going on. So today, we're going to unpack it. Where they came from, how they were shaped, and how they're interacting with the world today. This is the story of the boomers. Let's get right into it. Let's tune in. All right, so let's set the scene. The baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964. Now, they weren't just another generation. They were a surge, a wave. At their peak, there were around 79 million boomers in the United States alone. Even today, in 2026, there are still tens of millions, slightly fewer than millennials now. But for a long time, this was the dominant population. They weren't just present, they were everywhere. And they grew up in a very specific version of America, post-World War II America. And it was shifting fast. Soldiers were coming home, and the economy was booming, industry was expanding, the automobile industry exploded, and suddenly mobility became part of everyday life. And then came suburbia, right? Entire neighborhoods, block after block, were built through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Every home I've owned was built in the 50s, I believe. Houses went up quickly, affordably, and uniformly. Single-story ranch with a beautiful front yard with a nice driveway so you could park your brand new automobile in it, right? The American dream. It wasn't just any idea anymore. It was being mass-produced. A house, a car in the driveway, a steady job, and dinner on the table. That image, that came from this era. The boomers grew up inside that picture. Now, the household itself was also evolving. Traditionally, you had a working father and a stay-at-home mother. But as the economy expanded, more women began entering the workforce, partly out of necessity. The workforce needed people desperately. There was jobs being created everywhere because of these new industries that were evolving and growing at a rapid pace. It had to happen. And that change was just beginning, but it mattered. At the same time, technology was pretty limited. No internet, no smartphones, no endless stream of information. You had the radio, the newspaper, eventually television, black and white, then color. But that was it, which meant information was centralized, narrowed, controlled to a degree. The stories people heard about the world came from a small number of sources, and those sources shaped perception in a huge way. But underneath that polished image of the American dream, there was tension, and a lot of it. Racial segregation and discrimination were still deeply embedded in society. The civil rights movement was building through the 50s and 60s, and it wasn't quiet. There were protests, violence, resistance, both against change and support of it. They were initiating it into schools. The desegregation movement was happening. I mean, it was everywhere. They were forcing the world to desegregate, which obviously makes total sense. But not everybody was fully on board with, this idea of eliminating racism. Hate, you can't just eliminate hate. Hate is in people's hearts when they grow up being taught hate from the time they learn to speak. That doesn't just go away. Unfortunately, they just don't talk about it. They just don't talk about it in society, just behind closed doors, right? It's just the typical old way of dealing with things. But the boomers grew up watching all of this. This wasn't ancient history to them. This was their childhood. At the same time, social expectations inside the home were incredibly rigid. Image mattered. Reputation mattered. How your family was perceived by neighbors and the community, it mattered a ton. There were clear rules about what was acceptable. Interracial relationships? Oh no, absolutely not. Premarital sex? Oh, absolutely not. Having a child outside of marriage? That wasn't just frowned upon. It was often hidden for an entire lifetime. As I mentioned in the story about Delbert in the episode about the silent generation, when I say hidden, I mean truly hidden. Families would go to extreme lengths to protect that image. Children born out of wedlock might be raised as siblings instead of sons or daughters, aunts and uncles. Even grandparents would step in and assume parental roles, while the truth just stayed buried. We don't talk about it. Jeanette never had that baby. It's not Jeanette's baby. She's pure. And this wasn't rare. This was extremely common, far more common than people like to admit. And when you start digging into family histories like I have, you begin to see just how often these quiet arrangements happened back then. Entire identities shaped around keeping up appearances. The Delbert story is a perfect example of this, and everybody I've told about the Delbert story often has a story similar to it, if not multiple. There's more in my family. I just haven't really solved the clues yet, so I don't feel comfortable really sharing because I'm not 100% sure, although I know there's loose ends. It was extremely complex underneath all of it, There were secrets, there was pressure, and there were a lot of unspoken rules about who you were allowed to be. And that's the environment the boomers were raised in, the culture of the household that they're grown in. That's the foundation. And if you really want to understand how a generation moves through the world later in life, you have to start there. So what kind of adult does that environment produce? Because a lot of boomers made it through, right? They survived. They built lives, careers, families. They're still here, alive and doing well. But survival doesn't mean there wasn't a cost. When you grow up in a world where pressure, secrecy, and rigidity are normal, that becomes your baseline. That becomes what you measure everything else against. So when they look at younger generations today, kids being encouraged, supported, emotionally validated, even something as simple as participation trophies, to them it doesn't look like progress. It looks like weakness. And that's where the disconnect begins. Because from their perspective, hardship wasn't just something they experienced. It was something they believed was necessary. It built character, right? It created resilience. That was the model. So when they see a different model, one that prioritizes emotional well-being, encouragement, and inclusion, it clashes with everything they understood growing up. And they push back on it. Sometimes jokingly, sometimes critically, but often firmly. Not all of them, of course. There's exceptions. I know this, as always. But here's where it gets interesting, because some of the very things they criticize, they helped create. Take the idea of everybody gets a trophy. That didn't come out of nowhere. That was introduced by parents, largely boomer parents. Boomer parents who wanted their kids to feel included, supported, encouraged. It was a shift away from the harsher, more rigid upbringing they had experienced. I'm millennial, my parents were boomers, and I specifically remember, they weren't calling it, everybody gets a prize, but tell you what, if I got third or fourth place, most of the time I got a medal or a prize or a trophy. That was the starting of this entire movement created by them. And it was in many ways an attempt to do better, of course. Same thing with education. For decades, the message was clear. Go to college, get a stable, comfortable job, avoid hard labor. You don't want to live the life I lived. You don't want to do that hard work. Build a better life than we had. And that message came from them. So their parenting jobs was easy. So they could say they're giving good advice, as they should. From people who work physically demanding jobs, sometimes multiple jobs, who didn't want their kids to struggle the same way they did. It's admirable. It's the right thing. But now, years later, there's a shift in that tone, right? This generation doesn't want to work. Kids are soft nowadays. Everybody expects everything to be just handed to them. Wait a second. You start to hear both sides of the argument coming from the same place. On one hand, I don't want my kids to struggle like I did. On the other, kids today don't know how to struggle. And those two ideas don't fully reconcile. So what's going on there? Like part of it may be perspective. It's easy to advocate for change when it benefits your immediate circle, of course, your kids, your family. But when that same change becomes widespread, when it becomes cultural, it can feel a little different. Less like protection and more like decline, maybe, right? Isn't that weird? And part of it, I think, goes even deeper. Back to those early values: image, control, not questioning too much, not saying the quiet part out loud. There's a tendency to not fully examine the contradiction, to hold both beliefs at the same time without resolving them. and that can come across as talking out of both sides of your mouth easily. Now, again, to be clear, not every boomer thinks this way. I know this, but enough do that it's become a recognizable pattern. Go to any diner across America early in the morning and you'll see some older gentlemen or gentlewomen having conversations about this very thing. A generation that tried to soften the world for their children while still believing deep down that the harder version of that world was the right one. And that tension, you could still see it play out everywhere today. Now, I want to shift gears just for a minute because I think there's a deeper social dynamic underneath all of this. And it has to do with something we don't really talk about too much. It seems like a pretty obvious thing that happens on a daily basis. But I don't know if people ever zoom out on it. And that's the relationship between younger people and older people. That dynamic is powerful, way more powerful than most of us realize. I didn't fully see it until actually just a few years ago. It's a funny little story time, and I was 39 years old, going through a lot of change in my life. Got sober just a few years prior, and I was starting to notice everything. Doing a lot of thinking. I always did a lot of thinking, still do. And I started noticing something change when I'd be in public. Now, something that was strange. Every time I was in these everyday situations, whether it's at the grocery store or anywhere, anytime I was in public, I'd look around and I'd realize that I'm the old guy. Like, whoa, this is weird. I'm definitely older than everybody in this room. It happened often. And this was over just like a week, maybe a month, but I don't think it was that long. I noticed it. Once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. But it wasn't occasionally. It was constantly. And that wasn't even the weirdest part. The weird part was how people were interacting with me. And I've always been the kind of person who stays out of the way. I'm apologizing and sidestepping at grocery stores. Oh, excuse me. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I say sorry 20,000 times a day. I'm just always just trying. I don't like inconveniencing people. I don't like being in people's way. I just, sorry, go ahead. But suddenly that energy was coming back at me. And it was weird. People were getting out of their way and apologizing to me. Oh, sorry, sir. Excuse me, sir. Go ahead. Letting me pass and clearing the space. And I'm just like, well, this is weird. Okay, young man. It was so weird. But it hit me. And I felt like I crossed a line of some kind. I'm like, wait a second, this is weird. So I looked it up. That night, then I had this, I had the urge to simply look up what is the average age in the United States right now. And I'm pretty sure the Google machine pulled up 39. I think it was 39. It was 39 or 40, but I'm pretty sure it was 39 because I had just passed it. I'm 39. I was 39 when I saw it, and I'm reading it, and it says the average age of the U.S. United States citizen is 39 years old. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I just crossed the line, because as soon as you cross that average line, now, you're above average. So there's the possibility of running in being the oldest guy in the room is more likely, which meant in a lot of everyday situations, I was now the old guy. And with that came something subtle but real: deference, respect, automatically given before I had done anything to earn it. It was weird. And to be clear, that instinct isn't a bad thing, obviously. Respecting your elders is deeply human. It exists across cultures, across time, even across species. Older typically means more experience, more exposure to life, more accumulated knowledge, more wisdom. The wise man. And that part makes total sense. But here's where it starts to shift, because when you scale that dynamic up to an entire generation like the boomers, it possibly becomes something bigger. They're not just older, they're at the top. They hold a significant portion of the wealth. They own a large share of property. Even today, they're still one of the most dominant forces in the housing market. Google it. I'm pretty sure they buy more real estate than every other generation still at their age. And if I'm not mistaken, millennials are next at like 26%. I think the boomers are like 40% of the market share. They hold 26% millennials, 25% Gen X. So, they're up there. So you have a generation that holds economic power and sits at the top of the age hierarchy. And naturally, there's an expectation that comes with that: respect. But here's the tension. Respect in practice is supposed to be a two-way street. It's something you build, maintain, and if necessary, you lose it too. And what I've noticed, and what a lot of people have noticed, is that sometimes that expectation turns into entitlement. Not all the time, not everyone, but enough that it stands out. You'll see it in small amounts, public interactions, driving, just standing in line at a gas station, or day-to-day situations where the attitude becomes less mutual respect and more, I've earned my place, you move. And again, when you trace that back, it makes a certain kind of sense, does it not? Because many of them were raised in a system where you didn't question authority, where elders were respected, period, where younger people stayed in their place. And honestly, I think there's a really good possibility that there's a little bit of intimidation. Here in a minute, I'm going to bring up technology, but in their youth, they didn't have this wealth of knowledge at their fingertips. They got it later in life. And the younger generations, millennials, Gen X a little bit, Gen Z, Gen A, Alpha, we have all the information at our fingertips at any time of day. So we're pretty smart. And I think that can come off. That can be read in a negative light, maybe not negative light, but in an intimidating light to an older person. I think that has a lot to do with it. But, back in their time, that younger person, the younger people were supposed to stay in their place. And often they were on the receiving end of that. So now, later in life, there's almost this passing of the torch, if you will. I went through it. Now it's your turn. That grumpy old man stereotype. It didn't come out of nowhere. It's cultural. It's learned. It's inherited. And when you combine that with wealth and influence and numbers, it gets amplified. Now, again, not every boomer operates this way. I want to make that very clear. But the pattern shows up enough that it shapes how the generation is perceived. And it creates friction, no doubt, because younger generations are starting to question something that used to go unchallenged. Does age automatically equal authority? Yes, you respect your elders, but to what extent? Or does respect still have to be earned, no matter how old you are? And that question, that's where things start to shift. Just a little bit, for sure, because times are changing, things are changing. Regardless, we should still respect our elders, but you come across as rude, I don't have to respect that. Period. Respect is earned, not just given. Now, I want to zoom out even further because there's a piece of this that might be the biggest factor of all. I told you I'd get to this. And this is technology, more specifically the internet and the smartphone. Because if you really think about it, this might be the most influential invention in human history. In the Silent Generation and in multiple episodes, I've mentioned the automobile and its effect on society it has had. I'm going to stand firm on the fact that I think the internet and the cell phone, the smartphone, surpasses the impact on society that it has had over the automobile. Because, damn, not just because of what it does, but because of what it gives us. Unlimited access to information. Everything. It replaced Encyclopedia Britannicas. If you didn't have an Encyclopedia Britannica or your high school history teacher wasn't there, you weren't going to find out that answer until you got home and got the encyclopedia out or the next day at school. Now we can just Google how tall was Napoleon. It's every bit of information at our fingertips at all time. That's power. It also gives us instant communication with anyone, a constant connection to the entire world. That's pretty powerful stuff. That's a pretty powerful piece of technology. And that changes everything. And the key to understanding generational behavior is looking at when that change entered their lives. I think this is super interesting, and I think it contributes a ton to what we're seeing, because the key to understanding generational behavior is looking at when that change entered their lives. So let's draw the line in the sand, right? Let's draw that line. And it's early 2000s. It's actually 2006 to be exact. That's when the iPhone was hit the shelves, the smartphone. Of course, there were other phones before that. I had a BlackBerry Pearl a year or two before that, if I'm not mistaken, and it had the internet. It wasn't easy to type on it, but you could search on that little ball thing. You could do it. But 2006 was the smartphone, was touchscreen smartphone, always on the internet. And I feel like that's the turning point. That's when the world fundamentally shifted from analog to digital. Now think about the boomers. So did some fun spreadsheet porn here. I love spreadsheets. When I get the time and reason to build one, I'll build one. And I built one for this. But even the youngest boomer, born in the early 60s, they were 42 years old in 2006. So in 2006, when the cell phone hits the shelves, the youngest boomer was 42 years old. That's when they finally got access to this. Now, the internet was around. It was around in 1993, 95 is really when it took off. So the youngest boomer was 32 when the internet became mainstream. That was 96. The oldest boomer was 50 years old when the internet became big. The oldest boomer was 60 when the smartphone became big. That's 2006. So boomers were between the age of 42 and 60 when the smartphone hit the shelves, right? That's pretty significant. That's a pretty giant piece of tech to come into your life at that old of an age. No offense, but it's just the truth. That means the majority of their lives, they did not have this accessibility. They did not have this Their childhood, their teenage years, their 20s, 30s, their 40s, all of it was lived in a completely different world, an analog world. They were actually, to be precise, they've only lived 25 to 32% of their lives with the cell phone. Flip that around. I don't know whichever is easier to hear, to understand, but baby boomers have lived 67 to 75% of their lives without the cell phone. The majority of their life in an analog world. That's an adjustment. At that point, information came from limited sources: newspaper, radio, television. Communication was slower, more local, more face-to-face. And the pace of change itself, significantly slower. By the time the digital world arrived in full force, they had already spent decades building habits, beliefs, and ways of thinking that were rooted in an older system. And that matters, because adapting to new technology in your teens, in your 20s, definitely preteens, it's very different from adapting in your 40s, 50s, or 60s. At a younger age, your brain is still flexible. It's still forming, making connections. You're still learning, open to rewiring how the old world works. Later in life, those patterns are more set. It's really hard to completely change your thinking in your 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, for sure. So when the floodgates open and suddenly you have all the knowledge in the world in your pocket instantaneously, constant notifications, global perspectives, nonstop information, that's not just a new tool. That's an entirely new reality. And now compare that to Gen X, for example. They were younger when the shift happened. Teenagers to adults. Hold on, let me look here. So Gen X was maybe not teenagers. They were, when the cell phone was introduced, their age range was between 26 and 41. That's the cell phone. The internet, Gen X was given access to that. The internet, Gen X was given access to the internet. They were at the age of 16 to 31 when the internet became mainstream. That's 1996, mind you. That also means that Gen X has lived 33 to 43% of their lives with the cell phone, which is significantly better than the boomers, which was 32, or it was 25 to 32% for the boomers. So 33 to 43%. They're getting closer to that 50% mark. 50% analog, 50% digital, which that's where the millennials come in. Now, Gen X had access to the internet a little bit more, obviously, being the internet was available in 96. That means Gen X has lived 49 to 65% of their life with the internet. More realistic. Again, the internet, having that knowledge is important too, but when it's in your cell phone, in your pocket, that's a little different. So, they had their foot in both worlds. And they remember life before it, but they also adapted to it, and as it grew, as did the millennials. We grew up alongside it. We didn't just adapt; we were shaped by it. The younger millennials, for sure. Us older millennials, like myself, being born in '84, my percentage is really close to 50-50, which I think is pretty cool. I think I'm 48% with the cell phone, 52% no cell phone, or vice versa. I forgot. But us millennials, it was definitely more a part of our life as we grew up. My brother often says that, we had to learn it. We had to learn it and teach our parents how to use it, setting up routers, setting up printers, troubleshooting these issues. We didn't just learn it, we had to master it and teach it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. But when you look at it through this lens, it's not just about personality traits like stubbornness. It's about exposure. Boomers spent the majority of their lives in one version of reality. And then, relatively late in the game, were asked to fully integrate into a completely different one. That's not a small shift. That's a massive one. A shift in how we communicate, how we learn, how we work, how we see the world. So there's going to be resistance. There's going to be friction, because to them, this isn't just an upgrade. It's a replacement. And when you spent 40, 50, 60 years mastering one system, you're not going to just abandon it easily. Who would? Even if the new system is better, even if it's faster, even if it's the future. That gap, that timing, that ratio of analog to digital life, that might explain more about this generation than anything else. Now, I want to talk about something that's a little bit harder to see, but might be one of the biggest disconnects of all. And that's the cost of things. Because when boomers talk about working hard, and they did, no question, they're not wrong. A lot of them grinded. Multiple jobs, long hours, saving up for a car, for a house, for a life. Many of them, they were able to do those things at a relatively young age. That matters. I mean, hell, the average age of a home buyer back then in the 80s and 90s was in their 20s, mid to upper 20s. That was the average age of a first-time home buyer. Nowadays, it's in the 40s. It's currently the average age of your first-time home buyer is in their 40s. It's pretty significant. That difference, that matters, because here's where things really start to separate. What they're working toward and what it costs to get there was fundamentally different. Yes, they worked hard, but in many cases, that hard work could realistically get you a home in your 20s, a brand new car, a single income that could support a household. Now compare that to today. A lot of millennials, and I'll include myself in this, have also grinded 60, 70-hour work weeks, multiple jobs, pushing hard, trying to build something. I get pretty offended when I get thrown into the millennial pool and these kids don't want to work, often referring to millennials. And I guess it's just because a lot of older people don't know of the other generations. They just call all the young kids millennials. I don't really know what it is, but I worked my ass off. I still do. Maybe not as much as I once did, but I worked my ass off. 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks, 24-hour hard working shifts. I did it. And for a time, it paid off a little bit. I mean, it got me a house at a rather young age, which my ex-wife and I turned around and built some equity, turned the house around, made money on it, bought another one, as it's supposed to work. That's how the system was supposed to be working. Pushing hard, trying to build something. But something changed, especially around 2020. We discussed this in the inflation episode. The cost of the things, the big things, went through the roof. Housing, vehicles, education. They didn't go up. They went out of this planet. And, they're selling for tens of thousands of dollars over asking. Entire markets shifted. And what used to feel difficult but achievable started to feel completely out of reach for many. At the same time, something else happened. The small things got cheaper. This is really something that gets missed. It gets missed often by the older generation. But the small things, the fun things, the luxury items of the past, they got affordable. They are affordable. Technology, entertainment, everyday conveniences. You can go out and get a flat screen, a massive flat screen, 60, 70, 80-inch TV. $400 or $500. That is insane. Just to scale back, in the 80s and 90s, 70s for sure, a 30-inch TV would have cost $500-$600. Over with inflation, that's $2,000 or so. I mean, hell, just going back to early 2000s, flat screens were $1,000-$2,000. Those things are affordable now. The toys, the luxury, the tech. You can buy a lot of really cool things for $30, $40, $50. And that gets overlooked. Because back then, back in the age of the boomers and the time of the boomers, when they were buying these things, especially in their youth, not everybody had a TV. Those things are, high dollar. Those are luxury items. Well, those luxury items are affordable now on a grand scale. And this gets missed. And it creates illusion, because from the outside, it looks like, you've got all this stuff, and, you must be doing pretty good, and here you are complaining, but that's not where the pressure is. The pressure is in the big stuff. And that's where the disconnect happens, because boomers might look at a younger person and think, if you stop spending money on your Netflix and on your all this extra fluffy stuff, you'd be fine. But those extras, they're not what's breaking people. What's breaking people is rent, mortgages that have doubled or tripled, wages that haven't kept pace in that same way, student debt layered on top of that. And now even, with career paths, especially like your white collar ones, starting to shift and disappear because of AI, now those career paths that they were suggesting to their children, the kids, to the boomer parents telling their kids to go to college, now those college careers, if they did that and bought their house late, now they've kind of backed themselves into a corner, and they're kind of stuck at the house they're at, if they were fortunate enough to buy after they graduated. Again, I'm an older millennial. I didn't go to college. I went straight into the trades and bought my first house young, turned it around, and so on and so forth. But people who went that path with college, acquiring that debt, now what are they supposed to do? So you end up with this strange situation where the lifestyle looks more comfortable, but the foundation underneath, super fragile. And then, we circle back to that mindset again. Just work harder, put in more hours. That's what we did. But here's the question. But what if 40 hours a week is enough? Shouldn't it be? Shouldn't 40 hours a week be enough? What if the goal isn't to grind 60, 70, 80 hours a week just to survive? Till you retire and then finally get to, live your life. Everything's gone. Your kids are grown up. Like that formula doesn't make sense, but because it did in the past, that's just the way it is. I don't know how I feel about that. I know how I feel about it, but what's right? What if that's just another version of the snow day metaphor? I mentioned the snow day metaphor in the Silent Generation episode, and I'm going to bring it up again because I think it fits well. But in that metaphor, it's we push through it, so you should too. And the next generation looks at it and says, or maybe we don't have to do it that way anymore. I don't know, because at some point it's not about avoiding work. It's about asking whether the system still makes sense and whether the effort being put in actually matches what you get back out. Now I want to bring back that snow day metaphor from the last episode because I think it fits perfectly here. And before I do, I want to be clear about something, because I don't necessarily think this new hyper-connected, tech-driven way of living is perfect. I don't. Actually, I strongly dislike it. I hate it, to be perfectly honest with you. There's some incredible benefits, sure. Access to knowledge, it's amazing. Connection, opportunity, sure. But there are also a ton of downsides: misuse, manipulation, overload, all of it. People are addicted to the shit. It's complicated for sure. But regardless of how we feel about it, it's here and it's not going anywhere. Short of some massive catastrophic collapse of infrastructure, this direction the world is moving, it's happening. So the real question isn't whether it's good or bad. It's whether we're willing to adapt to it. And that's where the snow day comes in, because it's a simple example, but it reveals something deeper. When I was a kid, snow days were rare. I mean, we had them for sure. It didn't matter if there were inches of snow on the ground, the roads were bad, freezing temperatures. We were still going significantly more than the generation now, the school days now. But if we complained, we'd hear it immediately. Back in my day, we walked 5 miles in the snow with no gloves, and we had to get there on our hands and knees. You've got it easy. Just go, you'll be fine. Get to school. That was the mindset. My parents didn't do that a ton, I'll be honest, but we all know that scenario. Push through it, deal with it. That's life. Now, fast forward to when I had kids, when my kids being in school now, I started noticing something. Schools were calling off way more often. That threshold was a dusting sometimes, and they'd call it off. I'm getting texted 4 times by the school, the email, both kids, different schools. Like, it's madness. Sometimes just for cold temperatures. Sometimes the day before the storm even hit. A forecast alone could shut things down. And I'll be honest, at first it was annoying. I was that old guy for a minute. It felt soft. It felt unnecessary sometimes. But I caught myself. I heard those same words forming in my head. Back in my day. But that's when it clicked. I caught myself because I remembered something else. Back then, there were plenty of times when schools should have been called off. They should have called it off, and they didn't. Parents got frustrated. Teachers were frustrated. There were car accidents, bus accidents sometimes. People were driving through dangerous conditions thinking, why didn't they just cancel school? Why didn't they just call it off? Why didn't they call it off? I had this thought. So what if it's not that the kids today have it easier? What if they're just doing it better? What if this isn't weakness? What if this is an adjustment? An improvement? Maybe we got it right. Maybe they're getting it right now. And once I saw it that way, the frustration disappeared, because the goal isn't to preserve struggle for the sake of it. The goal is to reduce unnecessary struggle when we can. But that shift in perspective, that willingness to say, maybe we were doing it wrong before. Maybe that's the hard part. And not everyone makes that jump, because for a lot of boomers, that snow day mindset still holds. We struggled, so you have to struggle too. And it's not always said outright, for sure, but it's there. Underneath the complaints, underneath the criticism, underneath the jokes about how things just being too easy, there's this underlying belief that hardship equals value. That if something gets easier, it somehow becomes less valid. And when the world starts removing certain kinds of struggle, whether it's through technology, policy, or cultural shifts, it could feel like something is being lost, even if in reality something is being improved. And that tension between, this is better and this feels wrong, that's the heart of a lot of frustration that we see today. So maybe, just maybe, we're getting it right. Weird. And I want to say this clearly because it matters. Boomers worked hard. You grinded, you sacrificed, you built lives, families, systems, all of it. And that deserves recognition. It really does. We acknowledge it for sure. But at the same time, there's another side of that story because a lot of that hard work came with a cost. Long hours, missed time with family, stress that followed you home, cycles that repeated themselves sometimes. And now newer generations are starting to ask different questions. What if it doesn't have to be that hard? Not necessarily no work, not no responsibility, but balance. Working 40 hours a week and coming home with enough energy to actually be present, to raise your kids, to spend time with your family, to be there, not just provide. Because when both parents are working nonstop, kids in daycare all day, everyone's exhausted, just trying to survive the week, that's not living. Everybody's tired from working all day. They, rushing around picking each other up. You get home and, what are we going to eat? I got to make dinner. You get done making dinner. Did you do your homework? Go do your homework. You do your homework. Did you take a shower before bed? You got to go take a shower. You're making it through the day. It's just getting through it. And I think a lot of us are starting to push back on that. Not because we're lazy. Not because we don't want to work, but because we want something better. And in a lot of ways, we're starting to break patterns. Spending more time with our kids, being more present, paying attention to mental health. That's a big one. Ask our kids how they're doing. Listen to their response. Acknowledge it and maybe, provide for those needs that sound ridiculous sometimes. And just trying to stop cycles that have run through families for generations. I'll speak for myself on that one. I come from a line of alcoholism, and I'm working on breaking that. I'm proud of it. And it's very possible that a lot of that alcoholism was caused because of this cycle. Again, I'm in the process of breaking it. 6.5 years currently, so... And I'm not the only one. Alcohol consumption is down significantly. This is good. In my opinion, this is a very good thing. But, we're trying to break that. We want to show up differently, to be involved. I want to give my kids something I didn't fully have. That matters to me more than just grinding endlessly. And I don't think I'm alone in that. So when I hear the criticism, these kids don't want to work and they've got it easy, I don't see it that way. I see a generation that's trying to recalibrate, trying to take what worked and leave behind what didn't. And that's where I'll say this, respectfully, but honestly, we recognize what you went through. We do. But we need you to recognize something too. Things are changing. And not all of that change is bad. In fact, some of it might be exactly what we've needed for a long time. Because if we keep forcing the old model onto a completely different world, all it's going to do is create more tension, more frustration, more divide. And we're already seeing that. So this isn't about disrespect. It's not about dismissing what came before. It's about asking for a little bit of openness to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there's a better way forward. And if that shift can happen, then the boomer generation won't just be remembered as strong. They'll be remembered as the generation that helped build the bridge and knew when it was time to let others cross it. Boomers, I hope I didn't cross any lines here. I hope I was respectful. I hope you are open to listening. This is the Boomer episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about Gen X. You sly little snakes, you. A generation that somehow learned to live in both worlds, appealing to both of them. I like to think you're like cyborg, camouflage, slithering snakes. You guys are terrifying. Just kidding, Gen X. I love you. But it's going to be a fun little episode. I appreciate you guys listening. If you can engage with the podcast in any way, the show, any of the content related with it, I'd appreciate it. It helps the algorithm. Like, comment, follow, share, do any of that stuff. Do any of the clicky buttons down below. It's much appreciated. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Later.